I think on the environment, really everyone was very happy to welcome that topic to ambiguity this evening for the 21st and the own lecture. My name is Ina Shaw. I'm a professor in economics and ontology class of economics here at Toronto. I'm also the convener of philosophy and theory. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the first Australians on whose traditional land we meet and pay our respect to the elders, past and present. I'd like to briefly introduce the history of the HW Arndt theory. It honors the contribution of Professor Heinz Arndt, who was a professor and earned professor here in the over 50 years. He was one of the most published and influential Australian economists for many years, a global pioneer in the study of development economics, and especially influenced development, similarly of the Asian economy. He established in the Indonesian part which had the 60 year of celebration last year. So the project was established back in 1965. He was also the founding editor of two journals who continued to be active here at Corporate School. He was the founding editor of Collision of Indonesian Economic Studies, editor Italian, and he was also the later the editor for Asian literature. And this special series will be published as papers in the literature. So, Professor Heinz Arndt was one of the first to recognize the importance of the Asia-Pacific region of Australia, a recent focus that has been carried forward by our department. So tonight we have the great honor to host Professor Kunal Sen, to deliver the HW Arndt Lecture on Informality in the later month. So like Professor Heinz Arndt, he brought wonderful intellectual intellect and commitments to understand the development of the economic issues. And this topic is one of them, and very lucky to have access to this to listen to the fact that it's called this important issue. Okay, so I will just briefly talk about the logistics of my proceeding. So first, I'll provide Professor Giovanni, who is the head of our department, to deliver a welcome address. And after that, Professor Sen will talk for 1 minute, and then we'll have a Q&A. And I hope we can invite your insight and questions on the lecture. So, and after that, we'll have a meeting in the office during the conference program today to do the concluding remarks and talk about the thought of today's lecture. Okay, now, Professor Giovanni.
Thanks very much, Ishao. It is really such an honour to be here, representing the Arndt Gordon Department of Economics as the current head. There are many previous heads here in the room, and thank you all for coming. Thank you all for braving the rain. Canberrans don't like the rain very much, and it's been a long walk from across campus for some of you, so thanks very much for coming here to the 21st HW Arndt Lecture. I'd especially like to thank Associate Professor Ishao Joel for her opening remarks and for her ongoing contribution to making sure that the series runs, and including organising tonight's event. You're a wonderful colleague to have, and we really appreciate the work you've done, having just recently returned from a stint at Harvard University. So as Ishao already said, tonight's topic on informality in labour markets, I think, is so very relevant today, perhaps more so than ever. Over 60% of global employment is informal. This is people who are employed often without contracts, social protection and safeguards, both to ensure their well-being while they're on the job, but also when they lose those jobs. And with the rise in the digital economy and gig work, and especially the current very rapid rise in AI, the question of what will become of these informal workers is more urgent than ever. I just returned yesterday from China, and Among the many things I witnessed, the AI revolution just struck me day by day. I saw a robot policeman. I saw two robots in shops on their own, serving ice creams and other goods. These are jobs, maybe not the policeman, but the other ones are jobs that have traditionally belonged to informal workers coming in from impoverished areas in China, doing their best to scrape by. And I found myself thinking pretty much every day about what would become of them. But this revolution that we're witnessing, it's not actually only about them. I think they're the most important people to think about in this development context, but we could all become informal workers in the foreseeable future. I think that applies pretty much to everyone here in this room. And yet we still know very little about what kind of policies might actually work to best support them, including whether we should, as economists, as policymakers, as development economists, be thinking about how to bring them into the formal economy, whether that should even be the primary goal and whether it will be possible. So tonight's lecture will bring fresh insight into this very significant challenge. And I don't think there's anyone better to be giving it than Professor Kunal Sen. Professor Sen served as director of the WIDER, that's the World Institute for Development Economics Research in Helsinki, coming from one cold place to another, from 2019 until just April this year. And he's recently moved to another even wetter, possibly more miserable place, although we're giving it a good run for its money tonight, the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. A very prolific author, has both authored and co-edited some 13 books, and he's published in all of the best development economics journals. I think most people in the room know which ones they are: the Journal of Development Economics, the Journal of Development Studies, and the list goes on topics that are certainly very dear to my heart, and I think probably to all development economists and people who care about the well-being of others. That includes inclusive growth, poverty, social exclusion, women's labour force participation, and with a focus on India, East Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, so areas that have been of interest to many of us here today for a very long time. But it was also very nice to learn that Professor Sen early on served as a postdoctoral fellow in the Australian South Asia Research Centre here at the ANU from 1995 to 1997. And in a nice small world connection in that year, 97, I was based in Helsinki, very lucky to have a summer internship with WIDER. So we've been crossing the world at different points in time, but both find ourselves here at the ANU this evening. Professor Sen brings decades of experience, including his recent book, which I'm going to confess to having not read yet, but I absolutely plan to read it, having arrived back again from China and witnessing so much of that informal employment. It's on the job ladder, and I understand you've developed a framework, which I hope we'll learn more about tonight, that helps us to understand how workers shift or fail to shift between informal and formal employment. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here this evening, and I'm really looking forward to learning from you. Please join with me in welcoming Professor Sen to the stage.
Thank you so much, Jane and Yujia, for your kind introductions. It's an honor and a privilege to give the 21st Arndt lecture because, as Jane mentioned, when I was in ANU Coons Building, right across the road, for a couple of years as a postdoc fellow in the South Asia Center, Professor Arndt was very kind to me and to many of us who were very early career in our lives at that point. Many conversations we had during the times to come over for the seminars. Very active, very vigorous presence. You always meet Professor Arndt in the seminar room when he was there. You always asked them some of the best questions, actually. So I do recollect those very fond memories of Professor Arndt. And of course, we know about his deep commitment that Jane and Michelle mentioned to try to improve the livelihoods of those who are the poorest in the world. And what I speak about is about a core problem under development, which seems to have not at all gone away. And that's exactly what I thought about this topic. In fact, this is something Arndt would also want me to speak about. So I'm going to speak about informality, why it persists, and what can be done about it. I've been working on informality now for around 25 years or so. It's been getting on, but it's something that I always felt I've been passionate about, and I've been doing some recent research about it, which I'll take a little bit about. Okay, so what we want to speak about really is this question that we are in a situation where we have a problem of good jobs, right? We have a situation where every station is an exception to some extent, there's a job. And there's job starts in a situation where a lot of young people come to the labor market, especially from Africa, South Asia, the so-called young citizens, who are not educated, looking for jobs, living in cities, and so we have very few jobs that pay well, high rating of humanity. I'll show you some science facts. Gender issue, gender gaps in productive jobs, women are more likely to be poorly paid or and there is going on. A lot of issues here which we really need to think about. Why should we care about informality? Here's a nice quotation from the World Bank. The best report that's seen on informality, long-shot point. Widespread informality hampers development, progress, and liberality. It is broadly associated with weaker economic outcomes. Countries with larger informal sectors have lower per capita incomes, greater poverty, less financial development, and weaker growth in output investment. Pretty much informality equal other things. That's what this particular course is saying. And if actually we don't have to go far up and down, a few years back to get COVID-19 pandemic. And what do we find? We found this particular pandemic effect informal workers and it the most. Why? Because first that everybody is getting more and more people, especially if in contact, and in the government lockdown. Don't shut up activity. For example, you're a street vendor, can't go on and sell your stuff in the streets. Not possible. So the government, this government lockdown, along with the pandemic, the epidemic itself, has a massive effect on informal work, more than any of them. I have done some work, I have a book out on this in the COVID-19 informal economy, the whole period, which is 2 years old now, but it's got a bit of study to exactly problem solved in that time. And we don't really want to go back to that world where we were so badly affected by this. And also, one should keep in mind, I come from an organization, I was there in invited, and all the time talk about the Agenda 2030, sustainable development goals. And SDG 8 to me is perhaps the whole SDG, and maybe have economic bias here, but it is the most important. It is about promoting sustained, inclusive, sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. And that's a grand SDG. However, we are about 4 years away from 2030. There's no question you're not going to meet this SDG in most parts of the world. Of course, Africa, the red, the color, the way you are. But then even we have Latin America, we have big South Africa, we have South Asia, we have East Asia, we are not there, where we see absolutely very important. So there's no question that when 2030 arrives, we will not meet the SDG already. Okay? So in this SDG, essentially, encapsulates the informality dimension. What we take a step is what informal shifts. Okay. So what I'm trying to do is first I'm going to talk about what is informality, because this is a massive confusion in the literature. I'm going to speak a little bit about patterns and traits of informality, of trial facts that we have. What explains informality? What are the dominant views? Why does informality persist? And what I'm trying to make sure that finish the okay. So defining informality. Even if the past, given this topic has been discussed for so many years, we still do not know what it means. So when I talk about the informal sector, do we know what we're talking about? The answer is not really. So some define it by taxation status, some by coverage of labor regulations, some by social security status, some by registration status of enterprise, some by all that. Look at the ILO's definition here, and I'm just giving it out to you. This is the more recent definition. ILO sets the standards here of environment. And they do a very good job in this respect. Informal employment refers to working arrangements that are in practice or by law, not subject to national level legislation, income taxation, or retirement social protection, or other income guarantees. For example, advance notice of dismissal, severance pay, or annual or sick leave. this connection is pretty clear. In fact, it's even more. So think about a lot of this household planning now. Right now, I think we're going to put a massive problem of managing that, especially with the cut in motivation. And they're going on to different. So they are essentially tax net. Informal, no way, you cannot become informal. The tax sheet status is very much a problematic way to think about it. And so you can rightly see from the cognitive definition that which actually is a definition which we think is the most workable definition we have. The way I tend to think about it is very simple. I try to simplify it, just make it easier for myself. So within self-employment, I think of formal self-employed enterprises are those that are registered with national individual registration that might fix. But informal self-employed employment are those enterprises that are unregistered. The registration status to me is a marker of self-employment. But within wage employment, I think of formal wage employment being those workers for access to social security, pension, disability benefits, so forth, maternity benefits, of course, and so on. And informal wage workers are those who do not have access to social security. I don't want to be labor regulation to this because it's tricky. The labor regulation probably differ a lot in countries. So I want to keep it really the focus to be should be on social security or social insurance. So that's the way I think about it. And generally, I think most people now think this way about informality. However, how should we classify this workers? These are gig workers, right? If these are gig workers, that's a food delivery person there, it's a Uber driver there. And these are the workers who are considered as independent contractors. In other words, they do not have formal wage contract with Uber to the company. So they're not wage income. And because they don't have a formal wage contract, because it's between formal sector. However, in Colombia now, and many other countries Spain, the moment you book Uber, 60% of that will go into a subscription fund with the employer you pay. And 40% the right away. The right away, you can see now the blurring. And actually, this is something that's getting more common. I use very special points that gig workers should get social security taxes. Why? And so there are other people coming in, the spreads across other countries. Actually, Colombia has become big in all form last year, but there was big pushback from the gig worker experience, and they haven't been at that a lot. So they are challenging, right? But I'm just fascinating. How should we think about workers which are competing so much in different countries? Okay, a few facts of informality. So first of all, one it's obvious that a big chunk of informal workers are in right at all, right? So when you look at the graphs, if you take away agriculture, if you include agriculture, the black shades that Africa has a larger share of informals, right? Even if you take away agriculture, you could say, yeah, why should agriculture be there? Because substance farmers, if you take away agriculture, the only non-agriculture, you can still see that informality rates are around 50% global. The with agriculture, 61%, with agriculture, 50%. Okay? And the whole concentration in formal employment, non-agricultural employment, is in Africa, the Arab states, and in Asia. Not as much that. Okay. All right. And then if you look at different income status, again, this particular graph to me that encapsulates the problem of unemployment. Why? Because informality, the global estimate I said is 60%, low-income countries, 90%, 9 out of 10 workers are informal. Low-income countries, 80%, not much better. Then you get to upper middle-income countries, 50 or 60%, high-income countries, informality, right? But what's interesting, not just that, what you can see is the comment that you see basically, you can see that as you get countries that richer, you can see that the other components in informality change. So in low-income countries and in low-income countries, own-account workers are a big chunk of informality, along with one okay. Employees, the blue bar there, as you can see, as countries get richer, more and more workers employees, more employee wage income. In that employee category, there are both formal regime and informal. So one quick start of developing is, under regime, you don't have as many voting components. You don't have as many accountability planning. You have more and more ritual components. And that's a very interesting thing we see from this particular problem. And then the gender issues. If you look at informal employment rates by gender, there's not much difference. You can see it right at the top there. But within informal employment, it is massive. Contributing family workers, 15 percentage points higher for women than for men. Employees, 10 percentage points lower for women than men. So one satisfaction from the gender dimension is men and women are more likely to be in informal employment, but women are more likely to be contributing family workers than men, and then more likely to be employees, rich employees than men. That's very interesting, the composition, right? And this graph I find striking because you have thought many years, rapid economic growth, even in Africa, certainly in Asia, informal rates have fall, right? The ILO computers using that measures, and the ILO, I get this particular graph, in this 20-year period, hardly any budgeting for non-economics. For globally and for low-income countries, still around 90%, low-income countries are 80%, and for upper-income countries around 60%, always behind countries. So in this 20-year period, the comparable measures, you have not seen informality go away, even though we have quite strong growth in this period in the country. Okay? So that's something you need to again think about. And the last thing about this is that this is very obvious that the World Bank report again, that low informality countries have low wage poverty, high informality countries high poverty. Low informality countries have low Gini's, low inequality, high informality, high inequality. Informality equals low, high informality equals high poverty equals high inequality. That's the way to think about situations. Okay, so what explains informality? So there are two dominant views there, and I want to just go through the dominant views. One is that this exclusion view of informality. So those of you that are thinking about dualistic economies, Lewis model, and so on, Harris Rodaro, of course, essentially argument comes from classic dualistic model, where the informal economy is a last resort for workers who cannot find a job. The exclusion is basically going on. But they need to earn a living to find a job. And that's what they end up in the informal economy. And it is also that used before. The formal economy, there are barriers to entry, regulatory barriers to entry, even capital barriers to entry, national barriers to entry, many barriers to entry, right? But you'd rather be there than a chance. You'd rather be getting better paid and access to formal systems or certain protection. Informal economy, easy to get into it, no barriers to entry, hardly any. And then you have at the same time, it's undesirable, low wages, low returns, and low wages. Right? So you'd rather be there, good, but the problem is you've got enough jobs out there. Yeah? The other view is the exit view of equality. And this talks about individual maximization and says that Bill Maloney has done very nice work on this, that individual exit the formal sector and then after they go careful constant benefit calculation. Where would they have to be? And then they decide, well, I could be in the formal economy, I will get better paid, I will get access to formal systems of critical protection, but I will have the costs involved in being formal, the staff effort involved, the regulation expression, and when I balance it out in the informal economy, I get independence, I get autonomy, I don't need to worry about your expression, and I don't need to contribute to myself. Though of course I get lower pay, and it's also better unstable because you know how much you get in the informal economy. But you make a calculation, and you'd rather be in the informal economy by choice than the exit. And how views production, right? Okay. So I have been on Jay mentioned that I have been puzzled why is it the economies are so fetishized about formal informal minds. Well, 9 out of 10 work without an informal economy. What are we talking about? So I've been arguing over the last several years now, we need to go beyond the formal informal boundary And this book we did a few years back with Gary Fields, Tim Gilling, Dan Swansea, Bonnie Scotty, was one of the first we tried to put together a framework to think about what we call a job. Okay? I'll speak a little bit about, I'm not going to get too much into this, but a little bit about it's also in the press, it's open access, and so we do writers. So the argument we make is even the informal economy is important. It's not working, and it has people, workers who are motivationally deprived in substance activities at the lower end, half enterprises, factory workers, and we call them lower tier informal workers. And then we have informal workers who could be entrepreneurs. Depend on they sort of view that these are really bad workers, but they want to be informal economy of choice. And so they carry the informal economies. These are non-household enterprises, employers, work with the de facto benefits, but without legal protection, social protection, and we call them upper tier of the work. So you live in the informal economy, there's tourists and significant. And other again, another issue here is that we have to be careful that wage employment and self-employment are two totally different things, with their own working conditions and okay. Now, what's the analytical way of thinking about this? The way this is drawing from Gary Fields' work quite a bit. Gary talked about this in his own scholarship. That lower tier experience, anybody can get work. You don't need any human capital because manual labor that's already okay. You don't need financial capital. So second own accounting prices, housing prices, talking the low-income countries, we see everywhere own accounting prices. With family workers, we almost saw that in the earlier graphs. Wage employment and casual employment, casual labor, no skill required, just manual. Upper tier would be some human capital, some skill required, and all financial capital. If you want to start hiring workers at the enterprise, so with non-household enterprise, you need working capital. And for working capital, you need money, and you need someone to give you that. The right away, there's a barrier here which you need to overcome. And so self-employment here would be unregistered enterprises, they are still informal, they're not registered, that use hiring. And I've been arguing many different papers in theoretical work that hired labor is very different from family. Very. Okay? And wage employment, some de facto benefits, so there may be some benefits. For example, the massive number of informal workers in India in formal enterprises who do not get protection, do not get legal protection, but they're still working for. And so okay. So work with skills and so on. So let me show some pictures to you. Okay. All right. So this is I started on details also in recent years. I have started, but I have taken detailed analysis of the like I want to talk to these people. What am I really doing otherwise? So I've been going and interviewing people. So this is a group. This is a female-owned enterprise. I met a village in Canada. This lady has a few people now who she employs. So these are people she pays money to work with her. This is a runway making enterprise, say Indian, there is. And this is a person I met in Nairobi, in a slum in Nairobi. She's a street vendor. She said it matters. Okay. So this lady is lower tier. That group there, this women there, are upper tier self-employed because this is non-profit. Okay, clear distinction. Then about wage employment, this is a person, a technician working in a company, but not formal, like I mentioned. The workers in the informal price of contract workers, and this is a typical site before the construction site. And all those workers there are wage workers with zero protection. Okay, but in fact they get paid daily payment of wages. Right. So these are the examples of upper tier and lower tier wage employment. And here's a nice paper. The OECD had a nice report on this. Hopefully drawn from our framework, I'm not sure. You can see the job ladder. Maybe you want to be there, right? The lady with the umbrella, that's normal wage, normal work. But to get there, there's a long way. And you might end up right at that bottom there, and climbing up the job ladder is absolutely difficult for you. You may not walk it out. In our work, we've been using panel data to look at how work moves around, and we have what many countries, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And what we find is If you're a formal wage worker, you cannot move. You stay there. Okay? That's the most preferred state unless you get fired. It's very unlikely you move down. If you're a lower tier worker, whether self-employed or wage worker or wage worker, you hardly move. And we have planned it for several years, and you hardly see upward mobility in the lower tier. The upper tier up, there is much more mobility now. Okay, depending on the time. Okay, so the way then you think about this particular top ladder, you can start thinking, okay, maybe then you can bring exit and inclusion, the two dominant theoretical perspectives, into one kind of framework. So the upper tier is primarily exit driven, and the lower tier is almost completely exclusion driven and ratio driven. So lower tier workers substantially so and so forth are excluded from upper tier informal. That's why they're in lower tier. There's no need to be shift there. Upper tier, larger focus with growth potential, high productivity, more capital intensive, better paid jobs, may not recover labor social protection, but need some professional training to obtain these jobs. They may prefer to be informal. And they therefore are exiting from the form. Not every case, but quite a few. So that's the way we think about potentially lower tier, based about exclusion and rationing, upper tier, perhaps not changes. And I'll give you country from different. All right. So the determinants of informality. Just as I said, there's so much confusion about defining informality. If you look at the literature on this, on what the determinants of informality or rather formality, we have very little concrete evidence. Very little. Let's take a few examples. So, one argument we heard is that you don't want to be the formal sector, the formal sector with a lot of costs and regulations. And if you strip away the cost of regulation and make it easier to enter the formal sector, we should see more entry. What we have seen, very careful economic work on this using application, so on, very little evidence that if you stripped on formal entry requirements, informal product from both. So that's, but on the other hand, high enforcement labor regulation can drive some firms into the economy. What about the benefits of formality? Surprisingly, again, careful economic work on this shows that formalization does not seem to lead to higher profits on sales. Very informal company to register with state authorities, which means of harassment or tax infection, so on. The only way you can feel get some benefits from production of profits. But the evidence is that actually there is not. And no wonder, therefore, many informal enterprises, non-profit enterprises, do not want to move if there's no profit. Right? That's also interesting. What about some other determinants? Finance. Finance, I would say, clearer difference. Finance, generally, the argument is if you have access to finance, then certainly you can have more upward mobility for the self-employed who need working capital, physical capital, so on. So there, the evidence is if we can find ways to provide finance to all the way to lower tier self-employed enterprises, you might see graduation of that. However, on trade, mixed effects. In Latin America, trade opening led to more informality. In East Asia, that almost. Of course, but that's also trade openness non. Okay. Technology, the negative effect is still technology is more visible in formal sector, the routine technical work was factory workers. So technology itself is not a major driver of informality, formality transitions. Of course, now we've been asking for about AI. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about this on AI, but really the biggest risk of job losses is in the private sector, and in particular, IT. But on the other hand, we now see increasing evidence that the service sector companies in developed countries, Australia is an example of this also, are outsourcing the activities of developing countries by AI activities. I was listening to a news podcast a few years back on ABC from Australian companies moving their activities to India, because in India, a lot of workers have AI capabilities and are getting. However, if you think about it, for informal workers, it is mostly manual. not knowledge. What's the probability that AI will happen? At this point, there doesn't seem to be knowledge. Okay? The only way one could think about this is that if a lot of formal work is displaced by AI and they move to the informal sector, then they don't expand because of the second order negative. That's possible. We haven't seen evidence of this yet. Very different model this, very difficult to empirically quantify this, but it is possible. Okay, we don't know that. All right, let me now turn to a couple of examples from the field work I've been doing, and just to give you a sense of understanding people glass, because without understanding people glass, you cannot make sense. Okay. So here's a couple of interviews. I did an interview with the bookbinding unit in Kolkata at the West Bengal. I changed the name of the show corporate family owned big bookbinding unit. This is the bookbinding unit. From there, lots of books and papers all over the place. And Ashok said to me, like this mechanization, because more and more of bookbinding using the machines, it has a very cooperative foreign, but it's shocking this employment. You don't need that anymore. And we could skip transmission. But at the same time, because there are massive now companies producing the books, mostly for the textbook market, massive market in India, the school kids and all that, there's a big competition that is facing from the formal sector. And he said, I don't want to register. If I register, then I have to think about compliance costs, associated with protection, and I don't really need it. I don't need it. Okay? But at the same time, he said to me, I feel like closing down. Why am I doing this? And he says that his father was the one started this unit. His father came from Bangladesh and started the unit. He said, actually, I think it's starting hard. I want to close the unit down. And I feel this work around people for a long time. What happens to them? So here is a kind of strange story where moral obligation seems to be more important for sure to keep this book by unit running than, right? But it's a different story with this lady who interviewed a beauty parlor owner in Delhi, who started her unit in 1991 with minimal capital, informal acquired skills, started the beauty parlor from house, relied on provides advertising, and there was demand, had faced a lot of opposition within the family, it started this little unit because women should not be doing this kind of work. And also municipal authorities who are periodically relevant to the population. Why are you doing this before? Right? So, but over time, she was persistent. Then she saved, allowed to make some reinvestment and put some land, and now actually construct this building, utility parlor here. But again, she said to me, well, for me, formalization is really very, very slow, very slow traction. I got now commercial electricity, fixed signage, registration fees quite far. Right? For her, registration really doesn't really matter. Why would she be worried about this? She has a few people working for her now. It seems, very, very active in this beauty parlor. And registration becoming formal, something that's really different. Right? So you can see these challenges that we're seeing in many of these countries that formalization is either not impossible or not appealing. Right? Okay, so then what to do about informality? You may not again also believe this, but there is a massive difference of views among the two big players in the city, the World Bank and the IMF. And even it comes to terminology. So the World Bank prefers the term good jobs because that's a focus on productive and well-paying jobs. The ILO prefers decent work because that focuses on conditioning, how exactly our work conditions are. And that's why FG8 is not good job, it's decent work. Okay? So the World Bank would say, and I'm thinking about this a lot because many different diverse views also, is the way to do this is to reduce informality is reduce regulations in the form. But ILO would say, well, no, you've got to reduce the security, more employment regulation for the formal workers, the big workers. Right? The way I kind of put this into one simple sentence is the one view is informalizing the formal economy, that the World Bank do, in quotations, versus formalizing the informal economy, the ILO. Which is correct. And that's why I'm really not happy with the way the debate is made about formalization. Formalize. Yes, but this is highly possible. In 9 or 10 workers are in the informal economy, and its proportion has been roughly constant the last 2 decades. How likely is it that the formal economy can provide jobs in the next 10, 20, and long period? It's just not possible. So why talk about something that is completely out of reach? And that's why the way we have been arguing this is to think of a second option. What can we do to make the larger informal work better, especially with the job ladder? Right? And that's why this debate that's happening in the bank, I know, but many others, but the two dominant views, is in our view, though nobody will ever disagree that ultimately we do want to get the work that is practiced at form of work. Nobody. So I'm going to, we propose is to think about different types of work and develop, right? And think about where are the things in job life. And then it should depend on the country context. They can couple examples. So Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, most workers are in lower tier economy. How do we practice? Or factory machines. So for this sort of this kind of enterprise, for example, finance, training, whatever it has to improve, yeah, makes sense. But on the other hand, Latin America, there's a large group of upper tier informal workers who they have a chance. And for this sort of workers, focusing on removing policy distortion that disintermediate into the formal sector and make the formal sector grow, providing well-paid jobs in manufacturing and public services, is a defensible policy approach. But the Latin American approach doesn't make sense for the South Asian approach. The South Asian approach to us. There are two different kinds of approaches. Right? So that's what we've been arguing. Okay, so let me now end. Nothing on time, more or less. Okay, so summing up. Being in a formal job is arguably the more desirable status for working children. I do not want to get people to get the impression that I don't like them. That's absolutely important. Look at our own situation, right? We want to be in informal sector. So there's no question about that. But this is a state that is out of reach for workers to force workers in different countries. Whether in South Asia, whether in South Africa, whether in Latin America, it's out of reach. So what the point talking about a state that is not only possible for majority of workers, but I would even say for even the children. Right? So, and also, we still do not really know what is it that explains the movement from informality on. We saw from this two examples gave and of the evidence of economic literature, we still don't really know what works in making informal workers and informal presence move to formal. So what that policy that I advocate, this is still not clear to us what it is. And also, what I wanted to get at the point across, that we need to move beyond the formal and formality binary, recognizing the heterogeneity in informal. Informal work is not the same, very different, whether you're upper tier, lower tier, which is that, very, very different. We need to understand this. We can start focusing on the informal form. And so just to conclude, what I wanted to get across is the more practical approach for the needed for different types of work enterprises and various types of formal work. This is very much dependent on country context, regional context, the kind of work they're doing, and thinking through for this set of workers, what the best policy option. The formalization is not a policy option, but if it is, yes, let's start to. Let me stop.
Thank you, Professor. May I invite you to?
Sure.
Thank you. Fascinating talk on many complex issues. I'm sure there are so we'll go into the board right now. That knows questions that you like to learn. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor Sen. This is a very interesting topic. My name is Yu Sheng. I'm coming from Crawford School. My first question, I have 2 quick points. Number one is that how do you define agriculture, providing the informal type of job or informalization in your concept? My second point is that, I mean, when you're talking about the, how to say, heterogeneity in terms of this informality, it's usually related to technology progress to some extent. In many of the developing countries, usually this informality is coming from the low technology, disaggregate type of things. But the other phenomena, on the other hand, AI type of things also create a lot of informality related to the newly created like service sector. So I want to, how to say, check your comments of view in terms of how this informality will be correlated with the technology progress. Thank you.
We have plenty of time, so maybe we invite Professor Sen to answer that question first. And I think, yeah.
So on agriculture, again, it depends on the region. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, most of those in agriculture are in subsistence farming. They are small-scale agriculture. There is a little bit of large export agriculture, tobacco farms and so on, but not much. And so most of it is really small-scale agriculture. And small-scale agriculture, by its almost very nature, is informal, right? Now, you move to Latin America, much more commercial agriculture, soybean and so on. Brazil is a good example. And that is, a lot of it is formalized now, right? Cattle farmers, for example, a lot of it is formalized. So in Latin America, agriculture, not all of it, but quite a bit of it is formal. Then you move to South Asia. In South Asia, there are also small-scale farmers, but in South Asia, particularly India, there's a phenomenon which is quite surprising, that you have essentially a lot of agricultural wage labor. So they're working in a farm, they're getting paid, and these are clearly informal. And in India also, this also come from the lower caste. So there's also a correlation with social status. And so those are definitely informal, but they are not small-scale agriculturists. East Asia, again, I would say more, and I don't want to see East Asia, there's some experts on East Asia here, but I think East Asia more the Latin American example, because I don't think there's much evidence of small-scale agriculture of the kind that's in Africa, and perhaps also not of the kind of wage labor that we see in South Asia. So I think East Asia and Latin America are somewhat more similar, more formalized, but South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa almost completely will be informal, except the small proportion of estate agriculture in Africa. So that's on technology, I think it's an interesting question because, as I was saying, that at the lower end of the informal, the job ladder, technology is not there. I mean, these are manual workers, right? But at the upper end, technology can come in. I mean, for example, you're a household, non-household enterprise, and you're trying to market your products, you're beginning to use things like mobile phones, you're trying to use the internet, and so on and so forth. So those sorts of enterprises, which are non-household enterprises, are more likely to get the advantage or take the benefits of technology, right? And as you know, it's progressing quite quickly, access to internet and mobile phones in many parts of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where we have most of those in the poorest of the world, right? So technology can help in that way. There are economists who say that technology can displace workers, but the evidence on that is still not pretty convincing. That's why I'm also not convinced what we're hearing about AI either. We are not really seeing yet. Still, maybe time we'll have to wait a few more years. But technology displacing workers in the informal sector, not the formal. Formal sector, of course, you can see some clear effects. I think that's not. I'm more of the view that technology can help at the upper end of the informal sector, but not perhaps at the lower end. Thanks.
Kunal, hi. It's terrific to have you back with us, and you gave a terrific talk. Thank you. I wanted to pick up something a little bit related to Yu Sheng's first point, and it relates to the Sudley lecture you gave comparing Indonesia and India. And one of the points you made, which I recently quoted in a paper, is this the impact of Indonesia's more export-oriented industrialization on the labor market and formality, and to broaden it out, I mean, the early East Asian industrialization model clearly was, a lot of it was bringing informal workers from agriculture into the formal industrial sector. So I guess the question is, going back to other countries where it hasn't happened, I mean, is that one of the key explanators of these inter-country differences? And just a related point, isn't the education system critical in your story? That is, if you've got a high-quality, egalitarian education system, like you had in, especially in some of the Northeast Asian countries, Korea and so on, that means you've got the scope for occupational mobility, which you wouldn't have if the low tiers are trapped in a low education system with very few opportunities. Of course, that's on the supply side. You need the demand side also, because the people who've got the education have got to find jobs. But education is pretty critical, isn't it? But thank you. A great talk.
So it goes back, did I respond to Hal? Okay. So again, Hal, it goes back to the demand and supply stories, right? So ultimately, why is the formal sector still not large enough in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, but also Latin America? It's not large. East Asia is an exception here. It's because there is not enough demand, so there's not enough jobs being created because of manufacturing not providing the kind of impetus. And certainly now, I mean, if you listen to economists like Danny Roderick, the argument is that manufacturing can no longer provide good jobs. So that's one part of the story. That may be one part of the problem why in Africa and in South Asia, informality is persistent over time, is because there has not been enough formal jobs created in manufacturing. While Indonesia and some of the other North Asian countries, that's a different situation, right? So that's, interestingly, the one very good paper, or set of couple of papers that have come out on trade and informality are on Vietnam. And those papers show that that trade led to growth of the formal sector, manufacturing, right? On the other hand, if you look at the evidence on Latin America, that's what I was saying, it's a negative story. So, you know, whether it's to do with the nature of manufacturing in Latin America versus nature of manufacturing in East Asia, you know, open question. But then the problem in Latin America is manufacturing may not be able to deliver the formal jobs, right? So I think that's an education, there's a very strong correlation of education and the job ladder status. I mean, the correlation, we've done this ourselves in in other papers and other books, and it's a very strong correlation. However, it's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. I mean, you can be highly educated, but you still haven't got a job in the formal sector, right? So, I mean, one could argue that certainly you should try and get your population educated, so you meet the necessary condition. And if you're fortunate, there are enough jobs created now in the formal sector, maybe services, market services, and then you can see more of these workers easily being hired by formal firms. So education is very important, but one has to be careful because there's been a lot of focus in the policy discussions on education. But then that's a supply side, but not enough perhaps thinking on the demand side. Yeah. So I think the answer would be both are important.
Kunal, again, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I want to make a counterpoint to the last point on your slide behind to provoke you. Right? You started by indicating the incidence of informality and the relationship between stage of growth. Say, informality is high in low-income countries and very low in developed countries, right? Again, in Southeast Asia, it is lower than in Africa. But all this evidence suggests that instead of focusing specifically on informality as a given factor, like World Bank is doing, ILO is doing, why not focus on the overall development strategy? I mean, if the development strategy is good and you improve the living standards of the country, informality will go. I think this current emphasis on tackling with informality divert attention from the need for sound economic policy. given countries.
I mean,
I want to make one additional point. You said that trade liberalization has not reduced informality in some countries, informality increase. This is a typical point made by people argue against liberalization. Liberalization has to be one element in an overall policy package. Many countries in Africa and Latin America has reduced tariff without having supportive policies on the macro side and all that. Now, on that basis, just discrediting trade liberalization is not a good idea, I think. Thank you.
thanks. Chandra, that's a really important question about how economic development and informality are correlated, right? And that's exactly what we saw from the first set of graphs I showed. There's no doubt as the countries grow richer, and the obvious other thing is more and more wage employment. So one stat of development, which we didn't really understand before, but now we have very good data on this, is that as countries grow richer, self-employment decreases, including own account workers and so on, and wage employment increases, right? And so how is it actually happening? The way it's happening is essentially there are more formal enterprises employing wage labor, right? Large enterprises. But the problem with that, I mean, that's absolutely the long run story. But there is a short and medium run story which one has to worry about. Take India, okay? I've been working on India for God knows how many years. And what I'm really struck, and I've been doing this recent work in India, which also reflects on the HW lecture, is the fact that in spite of rapid economic growth, India has been one of the fastest growing countries in the world, right? Large countries. There's been very little change in the labor market composition of workers. In fact, what is striking in India is that about 70% of India's workers are the lower tier. Wage workers, construction workers, agricultural laborers, or own account enterprises. And the 70%, because I have data from 1987 and I have pretty good data in India, we have good data sets. And from 1987, reforms happened in 1991, growth happened after that. That share has not budged, right? And in the formal sector, what's been happening is that formal wage employment has increased somewhat, but there's been a massive increase in this upper tier informal wage employment, which is this what we call informal workers, informal enterprises, or in India we call them contract workers, right? So there's a disconnect here somewhere. I mean, India is one country, I know, but there's a disconnect here. And in Africa also, you see how much similar disconnect. So if the long run story is you grow rich, informality decreases, when do you get to that state, right? In between 10, 20 years or whatever, in India, of course, for a long time now, we have a situation, 30 years in India, we haven't seen informality decrease. Now, I'm not trying to say that there's one simple explanation for it, but there are many different reasons for it. So the long run story sounds very appealing, but there is this problem that we have where a country, you cannot tell an informal worker, when the country grows rich, you're going to be a formal worker. That's why my concern, why we need to focus on this, and especially the ones at the lower tier. On trade, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the way trade liberation happens in Latin America is a different way it happened versus East Asia. And maybe I actually take more value from the East Asia, the Vietnam papers. I like those papers very much because those papers showed very carefully done economic trades that trade liberalization did increase formal sector employment, right? So maybe there's a lesson to learn from Vietnam for some of the Latin American right? So that's something I think one should think about. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Kunal, welcome back. Good to see you again. You mentioned Vietnam. It's a lower middle income country trying to become an upper middle income country. And recently, the government has enacted a law requiring small informal enterprises to have point of sale devices, issue electronic receipts, and come into the formal tax system. Of course, implementation risks are very high. But what do you think of this
the idea is to introduce e-commerce into the country and to digitalize the economy. At the stage of development of Vietnam, given the reasonably high level of education and so on, do you think that this is a sensible way to go as a government policy?
Hi, my name is Dika from Indonesia Project. I actually reviewed your book on the job letter in the economic records, so very fascinating. And I think your distinction in terms of the approaches between the World Bank and the ILO, that is just a light bulb moment for me looking into the labor policies in Indonesia. And I think the question is that just looking into the policies and focusing on the lower tier informal workers. So we have gig workers, and then we also think about it in Indonesia recently, they have a law protecting domestic workers. So just thinking about the policy, social security, like ideally who has to pay for this? Like for the gig workers, the big employers, I mean, they should really take part in terms of making sure that the workers, the Uber workers, in our case, the Gojek workers will have access to social security. But what about if we think about other kind of lower tier informal workers, domestic workers, street vendors? What is the role of the state to really step in order to make sure that they have access to social security for health, for employment, and then they have access to pension and other things? So I think, yeah, I'm looking forward to your thoughts on that.
Can I answer this too? Because it's a very substantial question.
Very short, quite a few.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
On this, this is a very important question, that when do you bring a enterprise into a tax net, informal enterprise? In Africa now, because of this problem of not enough tax revenues, African governments are going after this informal enterprise and making them try to pay taxes. But you are not productive. You don't have enough sales. And now you have to pay taxes to the state. That's, in my view, the worst way of handling this, because all they're going to do is disappear and completely, go missing, right? Become house enterprises if they were employing, non-family workers. Vietnam may be a bit different because this informal enterprises are fairly productive, right? So they may be able to pay taxes and not necessarily be a disincentive for them. But you have to be very careful, because I do think the idea of bringing VAT invoicing to digital mechanisms and so on is a good thing, because that means you can actually broaden the tax base. But it has to be done very, very carefully, because what you don't want to do is disincentivize these enterprises to become formal. So that it has to be handled very carefully. So tax rates have to be relatively low and so on and so forth. But in principle, I think for Vietnam, this might work. I would not be convinced about this argument for Sub-Saharan Africa. I've been doing a little bit of work in this context, and that's not a good idea there, because they're just too small and not productive. But Vietnam might be an exception here. So I think I'll be more positive about Vietnam in this context. In terms of what, this is what one has to avoid. Avoid what Latin America did. Latin America really messed up. Not all Latin American countries, Mexico, and some other big messed up. What they did was they introduced contributory social insurance for formal workers. So you're a formal worker, you pay something into a pension pot and your employer pays. And then for the informal workers, the state provides pensions, other health insurance, so on. So that's a non-contributory, right? Right away, you create a wedge. And what do you do as a formal worker? That's exactly what I was saying about America. You say, well, I don't really want to pay this pension into the pension pot. I'd rather get out of the formal sector. What do we do for a formal enterprise? You try to make your workers informal, right? Because they know that if they go to the informal sector, they're going to get something anyway. So there is quite a bit of evidence that Mexico is a good example here, that in Mexico, firms are small. There's a very nice work by Santiago Levy on this, that Mexico, you have very small firms who are not formal because they don't want to be in the formal sector, because of this wedge that's created by contributory versus non-contributory social insurance. How do you solve this problem? Have a tax-based, generalized taxation financed, universal social insurance. Now, that might not work for any kind of South Asian Africa, but it would work in East Asia. I think in Indonesia, I think is moving in that direction. If it's tax-based, universal social insurance, so there is no wedge here between formal and informal. So the insurance follows the worker and not the job. That's the best kind of outcome, right? Because you're taking this wedge away. And I think we need to move towards those sorts of tax-based, tax-financed social insurance programs, which is totally universal, right? How much that would be in terms of tax over GDP ratios, that depends on the country context, but that's the best way to handle it. But so not creating this kind of distortion that we have seen in Latin America, which I think in Latin America now, there's an understanding that was not a good thing. I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure if it did.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Brilliant lecture. I was just wondering, I guess, your thoughts, given how hard it is to change the nature of informality, your thoughts about preventing the exploitation of the most vulnerable workers. I mean, has there been found to be anything that really works in that scenario? Think of those daily wage laborers and the extent to which, they can get exploited, and all sorts of health and other conditions, as well as sexual violence and whatnot. And if there is anything you've found in your research to be effective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee Gang-sung from Crawford School. Two very short comments. The first one is that it's not an absolute benefit or cost of being formal or informal. It's actually the right approach is to look at the relative payoff of being formal or being informal. With the institutional change over time, the cost of or the relative payoff of being informal will be lower. So therefore, the benefit from being formal will be very higher. So relative payoff, entrepreneur will calculate that one rather than the absolute, benefit and the cost of being formal and informal. The second comment is that you have emphasizing the efforts of formalize, and formalize. I'm wondering about a more targeted approach actually weaken that efforts. And so the question basically, what is the downside of this the targeted approach? Because for developing country, even though the pattern is persistent, but as a call for being formal is actually very strong. Less than 30% of our national income is subject to tax, while in developed country, more than 70% national income is subject to tax. That's just one evidence to show that, being, going through towards a more formal or formalized way is actually the way to go. But anyway, I saw that maybe some downsides associated with the targeted approach. Thank you.
Should I respond or?
We have 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah. So, Annabelle, I think the point here is that, we are seeing now, again, India is a good example. I've been working with the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA, which is the largest informal sector organization of women in the world. Of course, it is a large country, so that also kind of explains that. And they work with informal women because, as I said, most of those who are household own account workers are women, in both in Africa and in Asia, South Asia, right? So they organize them and for better working conditions, so on. And that's not, they're not a union. They're not asking for like labor regulation, so on. So I think those kind of movements, and we're seeing those kind of movements spreading because informal workers are highly disorganized. Why were they so badly affected in COVID-19? There was no voice, they had no voice. All the states, the way the state was supporting workers, mostly for formal enterprises and formal workers, right? Wage subsidies and so on. So they had no voice. And so there's a realization, I think, out of the COVID-19 pandemic, I do think that lots of organizations now understand that these people need to have some voice. Otherwise they'll go missing in the policy discussions, right? Thailand has been doing some very nice things about those things since the pandemic happened and they learned. So there are a few countries in this region itself which are actually doing good things about trying to organize these informal workers' enterprises. So that's a very positive thing. But it doesn't have to be trade unions because that's not possible with this group, right? As far as what you're saying, I agree. The relative profitability of informal, formal, it's important. But I think what I was trying to say, I agree with you again, that taxation ultimately comes from formal enterprises and so on. However, interestingly, in Africa, the evidence is, in Africa, you rely a lot on VAT. And interestingly, a lot of VAT actually is coming from informal workers because everybody pays VAT. So it's not obvious sometimes the tax incidence stories are a little bit murkier when it comes to formal issues. But I agree with you. I mean, as I was saying that at the end of the day, we need to formalize these economies. But it's the question, as Chandra was also asked, what's the time horizon here, right? And that's the point, I think. And I think that's where we need to be a little bit careful about pushing the formulation story too much. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Sen. We have more questions, but because limited time, I'm sure Professor Sen will be around for a little bit longer after the lecture, so we can continue to talk. And now, please allow me to invite Professor Janine Offling, a director of Crawford School, to do the concluding remark.
Thank you so much, and thanks for everyone who joined us here this evening. And for those who I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, my name is Janine O'Flynn, and I have the great privilege of being the director of the Crawford School of Public Policy. And on behalf of all of us here, Professor Sen, let me say thank you. And it was an honour to host you here for what was truly exceptional lecture. And you took me back to many of my undergraduate studies, which was a diverse mix of things, but you reminded me of many of those questions of, how do we think about social protection and things around the world. So thank you very much for reigniting that passion in my brain this evening. And what you've given us tonight is something that's really rare, and we were very, very privileged to be part of. A scholar who can hold the complexity of an issue and talk about it honestly. He told us where the evidence is thin, where the policy community disagrees, including in this room, which is something that we also like to talk about, and why it matters. And I was really particularly touched by your discussion about why it's important to get out and talk to people and to understand the lives that people live so that we can understand the concepts that we deal with as well. And you've really showcased for us, I think, the importance of understanding that policy work is actually very hard, and there's rarely ever a simple solution to a complex problem such as this. Your job letter framework gives us a lot of hope for thinking about how we might shift thinking about informality, moving us away from this binary world and taking us into a much more nuanced and complicated analysis of very important questions. The implication, of course, is that the policy challenge is much more complicated, and it means that we have to adopt much more nuanced and complex ways of dealing with that. And I think you gave us a masterclass in how to think about that today. It was extraordinary to watch you work across this very complex problem in a way that sounded so simple, but which goes to your extraordinary expertise in this area. And it is particularly fitting to host you here, even though when you were with us last time, you were down the road in the Coombs building. It's wonderful to have you back here and also to have you as part of the ANU and Crawford family as well. I also want to take a moment now to thank my colleagues who do all of the work to make these things happen, particularly to Associate Professor Yi Zhao, who did such a wonderful job this evening, not only running the mics around, but making an event like this happen. And I thank her very much for that. It's extraordinary. You've just arrived back here and you're up here hosting a big event, and it's lovely to have you back home. And also to Professor Jane Golly, who as well is just off the airplane and doesn't look to have an ounce of jet lag, for her warm and very, very generous introduction. This is such an important lecture on our annual calendar, and it's always a privilege for me to come along, to be in the room with friends from across the campus, our wonderful students, my colleagues, and also our friends from outside of the university who come together to listen to these incredible conversations that we're very privileged to host. So thank you. Thank you for your excellent questions. You're keeping us all on our toes here this evening. It really is wonderful to see everybody here this evening battling the rain, as I've learnt over my few years back here in Canberra, which is the ultimate challenge to getting people out during the winter months here. And of course, please join me in thanking Professor Sen one final time for really bringing us an extraordinary conversation tonight. It's wonderful to have you back here, and I look forward to hosting many of you back here for events here at the Crawford School. Thank you.